The North Atlantic in 1941 was not an ocean, it was a graveyard. German U-boats were the undisputed apex predators of the deep. They moved in wolf packs, striking from the darkness with mechanical precision. The British Royal Navy was bleeding merchant ships faster than it could build them. They had a technology called ASDIC to find the enemy, and they had the depth charges to kill them. But there was a fatal flaw in the geometry of the hunt. There was a dead zone that allowed the U-boats to vanish at the exact moment of the kill. The officers in London were desperate for a solution to this mathematical nightmare. What they got was a bizarre, forward-firing mortar that looked more like a toy than a weapon. The naval establishment laughed at the design. The senior captains mocked the inventor. They called the machine the Hedgehog. But this strange, neglected assembly of steel was about to turn the hunters into the prey. It would eventually sink 47 U-boats and change the physics of naval warfare forever. The standard depth charge was a massive barrel filled with 300 pounds of high explosives. It was designed to sink to a specific depth and detonate, using water pressure to crush a submarine's hull. In the early years of the war, this was the primary tool for every Allied destroyer on convoy duty. But the weapon had a fundamental logical weakness that German commanders exploited every night. A depth charge was rolled off the stern or fired from projectors at the rear of the ship. This meant the destroyer had to sail directly over the top of the target to drop its payload. The ASDIC sonar of the era worked in a forward-facing cone, much like a flashlight beam in the dark. As the ship approached the submarine, the angle of the beam became too narrow to hold the contact. At a range of roughly 300 yards, the sonar would ping right over the top of the U-boat. During those final, critical seconds of the attack, the captain of the destroyer was essentially blind. The U-boat commanders knew the physics of this dead zone perfectly. The moment they heard the destroyer's engines accelerate for the final run, they knew the sonar was lost. They would order a hard turn to the left or right and dive to a new depth. By the time the depth charges hit the water and sank to their fused depth, the submarine was gone. The explosives would erupt in the empty ocean, hundreds of yards away from the intended target. These massive blasts also created a secondary problem for the attackers. The explosions churned the water into a chaotic mess of bubbles and temperature layers. This acoustic wall blocked the destroyer's sonar for up to 15 minutes after every single attack. It gave the U-boat a perfect screen of white noise to make its final escape into the deep. It was a game of cat and mouse where the cat went blind and deaf the moment it tried to pounce. The kill rate for depth charges was shockingly low, often less than 7%. The British needed a way to strike while they still had a clear sonar picture of the enemy. They needed a weapon that fired ahead of the ship, not behind it. But the naval bureaucracy insisted that a forward-firing launcher was a mechanical impossibility. They preferred the blunt, familiar force of the depth charge, even as their ships burned by the dozens. The solution would not come from an admiral or a weapons engineer. It would come from a Canadian chemist who spent his life studying the physics of human vision. Charles Frederick Goodeve was an unlikely candidate to revolutionize naval combat. He was born in 1904 in the small prairie town of Neepawa, Manitoba. As a boy, he was obsessed with the physical laws of the universe rather than the traditions of the sea. He spent his childhood turning his friend's attic into a makeshift laboratory for volatile experiments. He filled the air with the smell of sulfur and the sharp cracks of small, homemade explosions. He was learning that you achieve the impossible by simply refusing to accept that it is impossible. In 1919, he entered the University of Manitoba as an art student, but quickly realized he hated balancing books. He switched his focus to electrochemistry and physics, seeking to understand how energy interacts with matter. To pay for his tuition, he joined the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve as a simple sailor. He didn't join for the glory of the empire. He joined because the pay covered his living expenses. By 1927, his academic brilliance earned him a fellowship to study at University College London. In England, He became a world-renowned authority on photochemistry and the physical chemistry of vision. He studied how the human retina perceives light and translates it into a chemical signal for the brain. This research was so distinguished that he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. When the war broke out in 1939, his Naval Reserve Commission was activated by the British Admiralty. He was assigned to a specialized unit known as the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. The staff called themselves the Wheezers and Dodgers, and their mission was to solve insolvable problems. Goodeve was not a career naval officer, which meant he wasn't shackled by centuries of rigid maritime tradition. He didn't care about how the Navy usually killed submarines. He cared about why they were failing. He began to analyze the raw data from hundreds of failed depth charge attacks in the North Atlantic. He saw the blind time at the end of an attack was a mathematical gift to the U-boat commanders. He realized that the Royal Navy was bringing a club to a fight against a ghost that could move. Goodeve decided that the only way to win was to strike while the enemy was still visible on the sonar. He began to sketch a design for a weapon that would fire a pattern of small projectiles over the ship's bow. This idea would require the destroyer to act more like a shotgun than a bomber. But to build it, he would have to fight a war against the British Ordnance Board. He was about to propose a mechanical system that the military establishment had already rejected for decades. The chemist from the prairies was preparing to challenge the collective wisdom of the Admiralty. He was about to propose a mechanical system that would fix the geometry of the hunt forever. Goodeve's primary insight was as simple as it was radical. He argued that a destroyer should never have to turn its back on its prey to deliver a blow. If a ship could fire its weapons forward, it would eliminate the 90 seconds of blind time entirely. The captain would be able to watch the submarine on the sonar screen until the very moment of impact. This would prevent the U-boat from performing its signature hard turn to escape the blast zone. But firing forward created a massive engineering hurdle that had terrified naval architects for years. A standard cannon or mortar creates a violent, concentrated recoil force when it is triggered. If you fired 24 massive shells simultaneously from the front deck, the force would buckle the steel plates. A destroyer is built for speed and endurance, not to act as a heavy artillery platform. The weapon would also need to launch its projectiles high into the air to reach a range of 250 yards. This meant the shells would spend several seconds in flight before hitting the water. Goodeve knew he needed a launch system that was lightweight but capable of high-volume fire. He also realized that the standard hydrostatic fuse, which explodes at a set depth, was useless for this mission. If you fired ahead, you didn't always know exactly how deep the submarine was swimming. If the shells exploded at the wrong depth, they would just create more white noise for the sonar. Goodeve's solution was to use contact fuses instead of pressure-sensitive ones. The projectile would only explode if it physically touched the metal skin of the submarine. If the shell missed the target, it would simply sink silently to the bottom of the ocean. This was the holy grail of anti-submarine warfare. A miss would result in total silence, leaving the water clear for the sonar to track the target for a second attempt. A hit, however, would result in a massive, concentrated explosion directly against the enemy's pressure hull. Goodeve envisioned a shotgun pattern of 24 projectiles landing in a wide ellipse ahead of the ship. This pattern would cover enough area to account for any small movements the U-boat might make. The logic was flawless, but the mechanism required to launch it was a political landmine. Goodeve wanted to use a technology that the British military had already ridiculed and rejected. He was looking at the spigot mortar, a device that most officers considered a Victorian relic. The fight for the hedgehog was about to move from the drawing board to the halls of power. Goodeve realized that a traditional gun with a hollow barrel was too heavy for his design. The weight of 24 steel tubes would make any destroyer dangerously bow-heavy. He needed a way to launch heavy explosives without the massive bulk of a standard artillery piece. He turned to a forgotten mechanical concept known as the spigot mortar. In a normal gun, the projectile is placed inside a tube and pushed out by expanding gases. In a spigot mortar, the process is effectively turned inside out. The barrel is actually a solid steel rod or spigot that stands upright on the deck. The projectile has a hollow tail that slides down over this solid rod. When the weapon is fired, The explosive charge is contained inside the tail of the projectile itself. The gas pushes against the solid spigot, launching the shell forward into the air. Because the spigot is solid, it can be much thinner and lighter than a heavy, hollow barrel. This allowed Goodeve to mount 24 of these launchers on a single, compact platform. But the British Ordnance Board viewed the spigot mortar with a mixture of contempt and boredom. They had already rejected the concept 3 times in the last 30 years. An inventor named Stuart Blacker had been trying to sell the idea to the military since the 1930s. The experts at the board dismissed it as an unreliable and unproven toy for amateurs. One senior officer told Goodeve that even if the creator himself proposed a spigot mortar, they would say no. The bureaucracy was more interested in following established procedures than in winning the war at sea. They argued that the weapon was too unconventional and that the shotgun pattern was unnecessary. They believed that the Navy should stick to the brute force of the depth charge, but Goodeve was a chemist who worked with the cold, hard facts of the laboratory. He knew that the current system was failing because it was based on an outdated tactical philosophy. He wasn't interested in the traditions of the Ordnance Board or the pride of the naval designers. He was interested in the number of merchant ships that were being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. He began to bypass the official channels, working with his small team of Weasers and Dodgers. They worked in secret, building a prototype of the launcher using whatever scrap metal they could find. They called the project the Hedgehog because the rows of spigots looked like the quills of a defensive animal. Goodeve was essentially conducting a private war against the British military establishment. He used his status as a researcher to gain access to materials that were supposed to be restricted. He ignored the cease and desist orders from the committees and the formal complaints from the board. He knew that once the weapon was built, the results would be impossible for the admirals to ignore. He was betting his career and the safety of the Atlantic convoys on a mechanical underdog. The spigot mortar was about to go from a laughingstock to a legendary killer of submarines. But first, the Hedgehog had to survive its first live-fire test in front of the skeptical high command. The engineering was ready, but the political battle was just beginning to heat up. Each spigot was angled slightly differently to create the specific shotgun pattern in the water. Goodeve was betting his entire career on a technology that was a running joke in London. He was about to turn a rejected relic into the most feared submarine killer in the Atlantic. The mechanical heart of the Hedgehog was ready for its first live-fire test. The final design of the Hedgehog was a masterpiece of compact mechanical aggression. It consisted of 24 individual spigot launchers arranged in 6 rows of 4. The entire assembly was mounted on a tilting platform that sat on the forecastle of the ship. This platform could be adjusted to account for the roll and pitch of the destroyer in heavy seas. The projectiles themselves were not the massive barrels used in traditional depth charge attacks. Each Hedgehog shell was roughly 7 inches in diameter and 3 feet long. The nose of the projectile was flat to ensure it entered the water without skipping or tumbling. Inside the casing was 34 pounds of Torpex, a highly potent underwater explosive. Torpex was significantly more powerful than standard TNT, providing a sharper, more localized blast. The tail of the projectile featured 4 curved fins that caused the shell to spin in flight. This rotation stabilized the projectile through the air and the water, ensuring a predictable path. The most critical component was the contact fuse located in the very tip of the nose. This fuse was mechanically armed only after the shell had sunk approximately 20 feet into the water. This prevented the shells from detonating prematurely upon hitting the surface of the ocean. When the captain ordered a fire command, the projectiles were not launched all at once. They were fired in pairs with a tiny fraction of a second between each launch. This ripple fire prevented the cumulative recoil from putting too much stress on the ship's deck. The 24 shells would arc through the sky and land in a wide elliptical pattern. This pattern covered an area of approximately 140 feet by 120 feet. This shotgun approach meant that even a slight error in sonar tracking would not result in a total miss. If just one of the 24 shells touched the submarine's hull, it would detonate instantly. The resulting explosion would rip through the pressure hull, causing catastrophic flooding. Because the explosion was localized against the submarine, it did not create the massive acoustic wall of a depth charge. If the first pattern missed, the sonar operator still had a perfectly clear view of the target. The ship could reload and fire a second pattern in less than 60 seconds. This was the mechanical end of the U-boat's 90 seconds of invisibility. The Hedgehog was no longer just a theory on a Canadian chemist's chalkboard. It was a functional system of lethal precision that was ready for the open sea. But the Ordnance Board was still looking for any excuse to scrap the project. Goodeve knew that the only way to silence the critics was to demonstrate the weapon's power. He needed a stage where the highest levels of the British government would be forced to watch. The fate of the North Atlantic was about to be decided during a lunch break in the English countryside. He needed a stage where the highest levels of the British government would be forced to watch. By early 1941, Charles Goodeve was running out of time and institutional patience. The Ordnance Board continued to stall the production of the Hedgehog through endless committee meetings. They claimed the weapon was too complex for the average sailor to maintain in a storm. Goodeve knew that the only person who could break the bureaucratic logjam was Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister was obsessed with new technology and frequently visited weapons testing ranges. Goodeve learned that Churchill was scheduled to attend a demonstration at a range near Chequers. The demonstration was for a completely different weapon that Goodeve had no connection to. He decided to perform an act of professional mutiny to get his machine in front of the Prime Minister. He loaded a prototype Hedgehog launcher onto a flatbed truck without official authorization. He drove the equipment to the testing site and set it up at the far edge of the range. When Churchill's armored motorcade arrived, the Prime Minister was tired and visibly irritable. He had spent the morning dealing with the collapsing front lines in North Africa and the Mediterranean. After watching the scheduled demonstration, Churchill signaled to his drivers that he was ready for lunch. He was hungry, and he had no interest in seeing another piece of experimental hardware. Goodeve stepped forward and intercepted Churchill's personal scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell. He explained that the weapon sitting in the truck could end the U-boat threat in 6 months. Cherwell was a man of cold logic and was immediately intrigued by the shotgun math of the Hedgehog. He whispered to the Prime Minister, who looked at his watch with a scowl of resignation. "I have exactly 3 minutes before my lunch," Churchill reportedly growled at the Canadian chemist. Goodeve didn't waste a single second of that window on a formal presentation. He signaled his crew to begin the firing sequence immediately. The 24 projectiles roared off the spigots in a rapid, rhythmic ripple of fire. They arced through the blue sky in pairs, creating a graceful, deadly geometry above the range. The shells impacted the water target in a perfect, tight ellipse exactly where Goodeve had predicted. Churchill stood perfectly still, his signature cigar forgotten in his hand as he watched the splashes. He didn't even leave for his lunch after the 3 minutes had passed. He demanded a second demonstration and then a third, asking detailed questions about the contact fuses. He saw the simplicity of the system and the tactical brilliance of firing while maintaining sonar contact. The next morning, the First Sea Lord summoned Goodeve to a private meeting at the Admiralty. The bureaucratic wall that had blocked the project for a year had vanished overnight. "How soon can you arrange a trial for me?" the Admiral asked with a new sense of urgency. The Hedgehog was no longer an impossible toy. It was now the Navy's highest priority. Production lines were cleared, and steel was diverted from other projects to build the first batch. The first operational unit was installed on the destroyer HMS Westcott in January 1942. The chemist from the prairies had successfully crashed the gates of the British military. Now his weapon had to prove itself against the actual steel of the German U-boats. The mechanical theory was about to meet the violent reality of the North Atlantic. The first crews to carry the Hedgehog into battle were skeptical of the strange new machinery. The early trials of the Hedgehog on HMS Westcott proved that the weapon was technically sound. But the Royal Navy faced a surprising hurdle: the psychological habits of its own sailors. For years, escort crews had relied on the massive bone-shaking explosions of depth charges. A depth charge attack was a violent, visible event that made the entire ship vibrate with power. When a Hedgehog pattern missed its target, the 24 shells simply sank into the abyss in silence. To many sailors, this silence felt like a failure rather than a tactical advantage. They didn't realize that the silence was actually preserving their acoustic window to the enemy. The Admiralty had to issue strict directives forcing captains to use the Hedgehog on all forward contacts. As the crews became more proficient, the mathematical reality of Goodeve's design began to surface. The success rate of the traditional depth charge had hovered at a dismal 1.6% per attack. Under the new system, that success rate jumped to nearly 15% in the first few months of 1943. This meant that the Hedgehog was nearly 10 times more effective at killing U-boats than the weapon it replaced. The U-boat commanders were suddenly finding themselves under attack while they were still maneuvering. The blind spot that they had relied on for years to escape had been permanently erased by the forward-firing shells. By mid-1943, the wolf packs were no longer the undisputed masters of the mid-Atlantic Gap. The combination of long-range aircraft and the Hedgehog was turning the tide of the entire war. The North Atlantic was no longer just a graveyard for merchant ships. It was becoming a graveyard for German steel. Between 1942 and 1945, the Hedgehog was credited with the confirmed destruction of 47 U-boats. Each kill was a testament to the precision of the contact fuse and the shotgun ellipse. If the pattern missed, the destroyer simply circled back and fired again without losing the sonar lock. The German commanders began to report a new and terrifying weapon that gave them no warning of its arrival. They could not hear the splash of the small shells over the roar of their own diesel engines. The first thing they would know of an attack was the sound of their own pressure hull collapsing. Goodeve's toy had become the most efficient submarine killer in the history of the Royal Navy. But the ultimate proof of the weapon's dominance would not come from the Atlantic. It would come from an American destroyer escort in the distant waters of the South Pacific. A single ship was about to embark on a killing spree that would set a record that stands to this day. The machine was about to go from a tactical success to a strategic legend. The most definitive proof of the weapon's dominance would not occur in the Atlantic, but in the distant waters of the South Pacific. In May 1944, the destroyer escort USS England was assigned to a hunter-killer group near the Solomon Islands. The ship was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, a man who drilled his crew relentlessly on the Hedgehog. The American version of the weapon was identical to the British design, but was often used with even more aggressive tactics. The crew of the England understood that the Hedgehog was a precision instrument rather than a blunt club. On May 19th, the England detected a solid sonar contact belonging to the Japanese submarine I-16. The submarine was a massive fleet boat, far larger than the typical German U-boat found in the Atlantic. Pendleton ordered a full Hedgehog attack, and the 24 projectiles rippled off the deck toward the target. Seconds later, a series of massive underwater muffled thumps signaled that several shells had found their mark. The I-16 was destroyed instantly, its pressure hull shattered by the concentrated force of the high-velocity torpegs. But the England was just beginning a streak that would defy all military logic and previous records of naval warfare. 3 days later, on May 22nd, the ship detected another submarine, the RO-106, lurking near a vital supply route. A single Hedgehog pattern was fired into the water, resulting in at least 3 confirmed contact detonations. The RO-106 went to the bottom with all hands, having never seen the ship that delivered the killing blow. The next day, on May 23rd, the England found and destroyed the RO-104, using the exact same mechanical precision. The sonar operator held the contact with a firm lock until the moment the shells impacted the enemy's steel skin. On May 24th, the RO-116 became the 4th victim of the Hedgehog in less than a week of active patrolling. The crew of the England was now operating like a well-oiled machine, their confidence in the forward-firing weapon absolute. On May 26th, they located the RO-108 and silenced it with a single perfectly aimed elliptical pattern of explosives. Finally, on May 31st, after a 30-hour hunt for the final boat in the squadron, they sank the RO-105. In just 12 days, a single ship using Charles Goodeve's impossible weapon had sunk 6 enemy submarines. The chief of naval operations famously stated that there will always be an England in the United States Navy. This record was not a matter of luck. It was the result of a weapon that removed human guesswork from the equation. The Hedgehog had destroyed an entire Japanese early warning line and paved the way for the invasion of the Marianas. By removing the blind spot at the final run, the England had turned the ocean into a transparent shooting gallery. The statistics in the Pacific mirrored the victory in the Atlantic. The forward-firing mortar was the king of the sea. The Japanese Navy was baffled by the loss of an entire submarine squadron in such a short window of time. They could not understand how an American ship was hitting their boats with such terrifying, localized accuracy. Goodeve's refusal to accept the blind spot had saved thousands of sailors from a watery grave in every theater. The man who studied the human eye had given the Allied navies the mechanical vision they needed to win. The era of the blind spot depth charge run was over, and the era of modern anti-submarine warfare had begun. Every modern system used today to track and kill submarines traces its lineage back to the spigot mortar. The machine that the Ordnance Board mocked had become the most successful naval weapon of the 20th century. The farmer from the prairies had outthought the admirals and silenced the wolf packs forever. The victory of the Hedgehog was not merely a tactical success. It was a fundamental shift in the philosophy of naval combat. By the end of 1945, the weapon had been installed on nearly every Allied escort ship in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The final tally was staggering. Over 5,000 depth charge attacks resulted in only 85 confirmed kills during the entire war. In contrast, the Hedgehog was used in only 268 documented attacks, yet it achieved 47 confirmed kills. This represented a jump in effectiveness from a meager 1.6% to a staggering 17.5% success rate. The German U-boat crews began to fear the silent death that gave them no warning of its arrival. They could not hear the small projectiles splash into the water over the roar of their own diesel engines and the churning sea. The first indication of an attack was the sound of the contact fuse striking the pressure hull and the subsequent explosion. Because the Hedgehog used a contact trigger, the blast was focused entirely against the submarine's steel skin. This localized force was far more effective at rupturing hulls than the broad shock waves of distant depth charges. The era of the Wolfpack was effectively over by the time the Allies reached the shores of Normandy in 1944. The Atlantic lifelines were secure, and the merchant ships were finally crossing the ocean with a measure of safety. Charles Goodeve's stubborn insistence on fixing the blind spot had saved countless lives and millions of tons of cargo. He was knighted for his service to the Crown, becoming Sir Charles Frederick Goodeve in 1946. The United States government also recognized his contribution, awarding him the Medal of Freedom for his innovation. But Goodeve did not spend his post-war years boasting about his mechanical triumph over the admirals. He returned to the world of science, applying his analytical mind to the British iron and steel industry. He pioneered the field of operational research, using mathematics to optimize industrial production and logistics. He believed that every problem, no matter how complex, could be solved through logic and data. The Hedgehog itself continued to evolve, leading to the development of even more advanced systems like the Squid and the Limbo. Modern anti-submarine rockets still trace their mechanical lineage back to that original spigot mortar. Goodeve proved that a fresh perspective is more valuable than decades of rigid military tradition. The boy from Nipawa, who blew up his friend's attic, had saved an empire from starvation. He took a discarded Victorian idea and made it the most feared weapon in the North Atlantic. True innovation does not ask for permission. It provides the results that cannot be ignored. The Atlantic is quiet now, but the legacy of the Hedgehog remains beneath the waves. The story of the Hedgehog is a lesson in how data and determination can overcome the walls of tradition. It reminds us that the best weapons in any conflict is the ability to see the problem clearly. Charles Goodeve looked at the ocean and saw a mathematical error that was costing thousands of lives. He didn't try to build a bigger club. He built a better eye for the hunters of the deep. By refusing to accept the blind zone, he gave the Allies the vision they needed to win. We honored the Canadian chemist who simply refused to take no for an answer. He turned a mockery into a legend and a failure into a kill streak that changed history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the Atlantic, hit the like button. Subscribe to explore more stories of the unlikely heroes who shaped our world. Comment below. What other impossible inventions should we cover next? Thanks for watching.